Hey class, hope you guys this week have been going really well. My name is Katie Kleinpeter and this is my second current event topic of the semester. I had Title IX and how it affected the sporting world then and now. So let's get into it. Take a second to look over exactly what Title IX is and the verbiage that is used within the law. Essentially, throughout this presentation, we will use this law and go back to it in terms of how it has been used in the past, how it is used now, and how it will be improved in the future. So just go back to this page if you need to throughout the presentation. So just a little bit of history of Title IX, and a little bit before Title IX, the Civil Rights Act of 1964. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 did ban discrimination on the basis of sex, but this was only based on the employment and not education. So then in 1972, Richard Nixon put into place Title IX, which essentially applies to all educational institutions that receive any federal funding. These rights include athletic programs within educational systems, that is, those all the way from elementary schools until you get to universities. There are three parts to the Title IX as it applies to athletic programs. Those are participation, scholarships, and then there's an extra laundry list of those things that cannot be placed into either participation and scholarships. In terms of participation, the effective accommodation of student interests and abilities is what falls underneath this first part. Then there's scholarships, and that is athletic financial assistance. Neither of those things can be discriminated upon in terms of playing, for our case, sports within the educational system. Then there's the third program component, which is the laundry list of benefits to and treatment of athletes. Some of those include things like equipment and supplies, travel and daily per diem allowances, recruitment of student athletes, and support services and coaching. Before Title IX was enacted, and then again right when it was first initially acted, there was a large difference between what we see now in athletics for women and what we see then. For instance, before, 1 in 27 girls played sports, and then 15% of student athletes were women in comparison to the total of student athletes. Now, when Title IX came into play, it protected women's basic rights, like the things we learned about in the last slide, that is participation and scholarships, and then the laundry list of other things. But as a human, you can understand that there are plenty of other things that women should be considered for rather than just basic rights. Now, as time has gone along, those things have been brought to our attention. So as we go throughout the rest of this presentation, you'll learn a little bit about how that has changed and what needs to be continuing to change. Basic rights are no longer the primary issue for women within the athletic education. Of course, now most people are willing to accept the fact that discrimination on the basis of sex should be highly prohibited, but rather women's representation in comparison to men has got to change. Now, as time has gone on, the words discrimination and sex have formed into a new meaning. Now people are deciding for themselves what those words mean, which brings Title IX into a different layer than it has been in the past. In addition to orientation, you now have to deal with sexual harassment cases because those must be observed, or a violation of Title IX may put federal funding at risk, which makes a lot of athletic programs within the educational system very wary of those situations, or at least we would hope that they would continue to be wary of those situations. As I did in my last presentation, I really like facts and percentages, so I left this slide for you guys to be able to read to see essentially what people are saying that Title IX has proved since its existence. Some people say that it has brought a lot of change for women within the community of athletics, but then also a lot of people say that it has not gone enough in the right direction. So take a minute to look at this slide, see what the stats say, and how you feel about the stats yourself. The current event that I'm going to focus on within the next couple of slides is March Madness, specifically the Women's NCAA Tournament, and how this event has the capability of presenting so much growth within women's rights in athletics right at its fingertips. So let's learn a little bit more about it. So if you know anything about basketball, you know about March Madness and the NCAA tournament. But if you were honest with yourself, you would realize that the men and women's NCAA tournament is quite different from one another. The men get all the glory and the fame, while the women seem to fall behind just about every year. So before we go into this year's historical women's basketball tournament, let's go back to 2021 when Oregon's Sedona Price posted a viral TikTok that everyone went crazy about that basically compared the men's facilities to the women's facilities during COVID. If you look to the picture on the left, you see the very small excuse of a women's facility for them to work out and get ready for their games, and then you look to the right and you see a completely different picture. This is the standard that has been set for men's and women's tournaments within the NCAA. That has got to change in order for Title IX to really shine through for what it is supposed to be worth. Now, this year's NCAA tournament really put women's basketball on the map. And it was honestly so fun to watch and so fun to see, being as though I played basketball when I was younger. So I put a list of the historical mile markers that happened within this March Madness, but I want to hit on two, and that's Caitlin Clark, who played for Iowa and who crashed so many records in women's basketball history. So first of all, she had a 40-point triple-double in the Elite Eight game and 191 points in Iowa's 6 games during the NCAA tournament. This obviously was a record. Astonishingly, though, this surpassed Michigan's Glenn Rice, who scored 184 points in the 1989 tournament. The thing about this tournament was, it was the men's tournament. Caitlin Clark passed a male record. I have some extra things on the list, but one I want to really hit on is Kim Mulkey's Game Day Fits. Now, this is LSU's fearless leader, and she has hit the social media platforms as people are obsessing over what she wore. This has put women on the map. Yes, they can wear fashionable clothes and still be athletes. I would suggest taking a minute and looking up all her outfits from March Madness, as they were quite the wondrous thing. Speaking of Kim Mulkey, we have to talk about the historical championship game that saw viewership like no other. In fact, the average of 9.9 million viewers trumped the previous record of 5.7 million back in 2002 when Connecticut won the title. Peak viewership was 12.6 million people, and that is double last year's championship. This event was also the most viewed college sporting event to ever be produced on ESPN+. This just proved that women's basketball has incredible potential to blossom. In fact, the New York Times suggests that by 2025, it could be worth $85 million, which, with compared to the $6 million that ESPN has currently placed its agreement at, that is a large jump. The absolute largest thing that needs to change for women's sports in general is a change in broadcasting agreements. There is a huge gap in media deals for distribution, promotion, and coverage in dollars for media rights. We talked a minute ago about the difference between the men's and women's NCAA tournament. The money difference between the two is astonishing. But if you think about it, the deals that are associated with the men's side includes Ideal Commitment, as March Madness is promoted heavily. That promotion naturally brings about sponsorships, which in turn puts even more money back into the pot. Simply put, the money associated with media rights of men's basketball sends high value to the sport that builds up on top of itself yearly. And now I know that women's sports naturally, as of right now, do not bring in as much money as men do, but if broadcasting agreements were pivoted in the direction of women's basketball or sports in general, that would start to change, just like we saw in the championship game and March Madness for women in 2023. With so many conduits for viewing of games in both men's and women's sports, there's got to be a lessening of the gap between who desires to watch men's sports at the collegiate level and who decides to watch women's sports at the collegiate level. There's a few things in terms of marketing that need to be done in order for the content of women's basketball to be shared in a very desirable way. Now, the first thing would be that it needs to be great entertainment, not just a cause. A lot of the times, people feel as though they need to go to women's sports in order to help the cause rather than men's, because men's always gets the attention. But we need to see it as great entertainment. We need to see it as something we want to do, not something that we have to do. Secondly, we need to see women's sports in terms of the individual and not the collective. If you think about it, men's sports promote athletes. They don't promote teams as much as they promote athletes. Athletes sell their brands. Athletes have social media accounts that are followed by great fan bases, and the list goes on and on. The third thing is that women's sports cannot focus too much on the future. It's got to be a one step at a time kind of thing. Baby steps turn into big things. For instance, the women's side of the March Madness just saw LSU really stand out, and people talk about LSU and the win that they experienced against Iowa. So now, in order to increase that experience, women's sports need to ride the waves that they are given and then kick it into high gear, because they can take advantage of what has occurred in the past and spearhead it into the future. Title IX has come such a long way since its creation in 1972. Women's athletics have seen so many highs and so many lows. They've experienced basic rights within educational and athletic institutions, but now it is time for pure representation. Better representation in media broadcasting agreements is the first step to this long-awaited adjustment. Men simply get more coverage on TV than women do. Once women's sports are marketed in a way that sets them apart, that is going to be when they become talented enough and worthy enough for appreciation, even though they already are. The NCAA Women's National Championship gave the world a glimpse into those possibilities. Now, like I said before, it's time to ride that wave and kick it into high gear. I hope you enjoyed this presentation and learned a lot, and I hope that you are the reason that women's sports becomes much more appreciated, as it should be. And then here are my resources. Have a great rest of your week.